Of course. Here is the video script paraphrased with slight alterations to word order and structure, while meticulously preserving the original tone, articulating style, and factual content. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. 1935, Alabama. The family who impregnated the dead, the most macabre ritual of rural cults. Deep in the shadowed hills of northern Alabama, where civilization seemed to retreat before the ancient Appalachian wilderness, there existed a valley that time had willingly forgotten. The year was 1935. And while the rest of America struggled through the Great Depression, the Blackwood family had created their own isolated world, untouched by the outside for nearly 7 decades. Our story begins on a crisp autumn morning when County Health Inspector Thomas Mitchell ventured into the area locals called Blackwood Hollow. Reports of unusual illnesses and concerning conditions had finally reached Montgomery, prompting this rare intrusion into a community that had deliberately severed itself from society since before the Civil War. The road disappeared about 3 miles back, Mitchell would later write in his official report. I followed what appeared to be a footpath until I encountered the first structures, crude cabins with no electricity or running water, despite the Tennessee Valley Authority's recent efforts in neighboring counties. What Mitchell discovered that day would eventually become one of the most disturbing documented cases of generational consanguinity in American history. The Blackwood family, approximately 64 individuals spanning 4 generations, had maintained a completely closed genetic lineage since 1868. It was then that Confederate veteran Isaiah Blackwood led his extended family into the hills to escape Reconstruction. The physical consequences were immediately apparent. Mitchell observed that nearly half the community members exhibited distinctive facial anomalies, severely recessed chins, unusually close-set eyes, and pronounced brow ridges. Many adults stood barely 5 feet tall with disproportionately short limbs. But these visible traits were merely surface manifestations of a much deeper genetic catastrophe. Children as old as 12 unable to form coherent sentences, Mitchell noted, individuals with the cognitive development of toddlers. 3 separate cases of individuals born with extra digits that had been crudely removed. What truly distinguished the Blackwood case from other documented instances of isolated communities was their development of ritualistic practices surrounding reproduction. Through careful interviews with the more communicative family members, Mitchell began to uncover a system so aberrant that his initial reports were dismissed as fantasy by his superiors. The Blackwoods had developed their own insular belief system, a strange amalgamation of distorted Christianity, folk superstitions, and practices designed to rationalize their increasingly limited mating options. The community followed the leadership of Elijah Blackwood, Isaiah's grandson and the family patriarch, who enforced a strict hierarchy and controlled all aspects of family life. At the center of this belief system was what they called the returning, a practice that would eventually give the case its infamous name. When a young woman died before bearing children, the Blackwoods did not consider her reproductive capacity ended. In a ritual shrouded in secrecy, certain male family members were designated to reunite with recently deceased female relatives before burial, believing this would allow the deceased spirit to return through future offspring. This practice, combined with systematic arranged unions between first cousins, siblings, and occasionally parent and child, had created a closed genetic pool with catastrophic consequences. Medical examinations would later reveal that 83% of children born in the community after 1920 suffered from various genetic disorders, many fatal in early childhood. The discovery of the Blackwood community would eventually lead to one of Alabama's most complex legal and ethical challenges of the era, forcing authorities to confront questions about the limits of religious freedom, the state's responsibility toward isolated citizens, and the difficult balance between individual autonomy and protection from harm. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. Elijah Blackwood was 67 years old in 1935, though his hunched posture and clouded eyes suggested someone much older. As the health department investigation deepened, officials learned that Elijah had established an intricate system of rules governing every aspect of family life, particularly reproduction. County records indicated that Isaiah Blackwood had originally fled to the hills with his wife, 3 brothers, and their spouses, and 11 children between them. This relatively small founding population had expanded to over 60 individuals within 3 generations, but with virtually no genetic diversity introduced. The patriarch's authority was absolute, explained Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, one of the few female physicians working with Alabama's Department of Public Health at the time. Family members described a complex hierarchy where Elijah determined who would be paired, when, and under what circumstances. The Blackwood family operated under a distorted interpretation of biblical passages, selectively citing Old Testament examples of familial marriages while developing elaborate justifications for their practices. Elijah maintained his authority through a combination of religious fear, isolation, and the family's genuine belief that the outside world was spiritually contaminated. Most disturbing was the discovery of the family's Book of Returns, a handwritten ledger documenting unions between the living and the deceased. This practice, which had apparently begun in the 1890s, was surrounded by elaborate ceremony. The deceased young women, typically those who had died from complications of childbirth, a tragically common occurrence in the community, were prepared by the eldest women of the family. The ritual was supposedly meant to preserve the spirit line and ensure the deceased's essence remained in the family bloodline. The genetic consequences of such practices over multiple generations created a cascade of increasingly severe health conditions, Dr. Whitfield documented. We observed unusually high rates of heart defects, neurological abnormalities, and immune deficiencies. Of particular concern were the cognitive impairments present in approximately 70% of children under 16. The physical isolation of Blackwood Hollow had been reinforced by deliberate efforts to remain hidden. The few times outsiders had stumbled upon the community in previous decades, they were either threatened or misled about the nature of the family relationships. On rare occasions, when Blackwood men ventured into nearby towns for essential supplies, they spoke little and revealed nothing about their home life. One former shopkeeper from the nearest town, some 12 miles distant, recalled, they'd come maybe twice a year, always the same 3 or 4 men, paid in old coins, sometimes Confederate notes that hadn't been valid for decades. Wouldn't talk except to ask for what they needed. Always seemed jumpy, like they expected trouble. This isolation had another devastating consequence. Without access to medical care, preventable conditions often became fatal. Women frequently died in childbirth. Children with treatable conditions perished from complications. Those with severe congenital abnormalities, increasingly common with each generation, rarely survived to adulthood. Perhaps most tragically, the community seemed unaware that their suffering was self-inflicted. They had developed elaborate supernatural explanations for the increasing health problems, believing them to be spiritual tests rather than the inevitable result of genetic collapse. They had no concept of genetics, Mitchell noted. When I attempted to explain why their children were suffering, they became hostile. Elijah accused me of bringing outside sickness into their community with my words. As investigators pieced together the family structure, they discovered that by the 1930s, every Blackwood was related to every other through multiple familial pathways. The average coefficient of relationship within the community was estimated to be higher than any previously documented case in medical literature, exceeding even the infamous Spanish Habsburg dynasty that collapsed under the weight of its own consanguinity. The situation raised profound questions. How should the state respond to such extreme isolation when it resulted in demonstrable harm? What rights did these children have to protection, education, and medical care? And how had such practices continued undetected for so long in a state increasingly connected by modern infrastructure and government services? These questions would soon be answered as authorities prepared for an intervention that would permanently alter the fate of the Blackwood family and expose their hidden world to the harsh light of public scrutiny. By late autumn of 1935, state authorities had gathered enough evidence to justify intervention in Blackwood Hollow. What they could not anticipate was the resistance they would face, not just from the family, but from a system unprepared to address such an extreme case. We expected to find poverty and isolation, Sheriff James Donovan recalled. What we found was something from another century entirely. The November 14 intervention began with a convoy of vehicles carrying health officials, law enforcement, and social workers navigating the crude paths into Blackwood Hollow. Their arrival triggered immediate panic among the community members, many of whom fled into the surrounding forest. Elijah Blackwood stood his ground on the porch of the main family cabin, a shotgun across his lap. Beside him sat his sister-wife Martha, herself visibly affected by generations of consanguinity with her characteristically small jaw and misaligned eyes. Their confrontation with authorities would later be described as a collision between two utterly different Americas. "This is Blackwood land," Elijah reportedly declared. "God gave us this place to keep our blood pure from the wickedness outside. You have no authority here." The physical condition of the children ultimately forced officials' hands. Among the 57 family members present that day, 17 were under 12 years old. Medical personnel on site identified 12 children requiring immediate medical attention, including a 9-year-old boy with an untreated bone infection and twin 5-year-old girls with severe hydrocephalus. The community's living conditions shocked even experienced social workers. The cabins lacked basic sanitation. Many children showed signs of malnutrition. A crude family cemetery contained 47 graves, most unmarked except for small stone cairns, many sized for infants and young children. Most disturbing was the discovery of a separate burial area reserved for what the family called the returning ones. These graves, exclusively female, were marked with distinctive symbols and maintained with unusual care. It was here that investigators found physical evidence supporting the accounts of post-mortem rituals, specific preparations of the graves that aligned with the descriptions in the family's Book of Returns. I need to pause this story for a moment. If you're feeling the same sense of disbelief and sorrow that I am while recounting this tragic history, type "This bloodline should have ended" in the comments. Your words acknowledge the suffering these innocent children endured and help us remember the importance of protecting the vulnerable from such harmful practices. The children's removal from Blackwood Hollow triggered the case's transition from public health emergency to legal battleground. Elijah and 7 other adult male family members were taken into custody, while the remaining adults and children were transported to facilities in Montgomery for medical evaluation and care. Medical examinations revealed the full extent of the genetic catastrophe. Dr. Raymond Phillips, who led the pediatric assessments, documented his findings. The prevalence of recessive genetic disorders is unlike anything in modern medical literature. We've identified cases of phenylketonuria, Tay-Sachs disease, and multiple rare metabolic disorders. All conditions that become exponentially more common with sustained consanguinity. The adult Blackwoods exhibited their own constellation of health issues. Hearing impairment affected nearly 60% of adults over 30. Early-onset dementia-like symptoms appeared common among those in their 40s. Fertility had declined precipitously in the youngest adult generation, nature's own defense against the genetic collapse. The legal proceedings that followed set important precedents for state intervention in isolated religious communities. Prosecutors faced the challenge of applying modern laws to practices that seemed to belong to a different era entirely. The defense argued that the Blackwoods' isolation and religious beliefs should protect them from outside interference. Judge William Thornton, who presided over the case, wrote in his decision, "While this court respects religious freedom as fundamental to our nation, no belief system, however sincerely held, grants license to inflict demonstrable harm upon children. The evidence of physical and developmental injuries resulting directly from the systematic consanguinity practiced by the defendants is overwhelming and cannot be protected under claims of religious liberty." Elijah Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years for multiple charges related to child endangerment and abuse of a corpse, the legal term applied to the post-mortem practices documented in the case. Other adult male family members received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The women and children faced a different challenge: integration into a society they had been taught to fear. The younger children, placed with foster families, showed remarkable adaptability despite their developmental delays. Many of the older family members, however, struggled with the transition, their entire world view shattered by exposure to modern America in the midst of the Great Depression. As 1936 began, the Blackwood case faded from headlines, but its implications for public health policy, legal precedent, and our understanding of genetic inheritance would continue to resonate through medical and legal literature for decades to come. The spring of 1936 brought new challenges as the state grappled with the aftermath of the Blackwood case. While the legal proceedings had concluded, the more complex work of addressing the family's medical and social needs was just beginning. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, whose documentation had been crucial to the case, continued working with the Blackwood children. Her pioneering approach, combining medical intervention with careful psychological support, would later influence protocols for helping individuals from isolated communities. These children exist in a unique medical category, Dr. Whitfield wrote. Their physical conditions result directly from generational consanguinity, but their social and psychological challenges stem from isolation and indoctrination. Both aspects require simultaneous treatment. The youngest Blackwood children adapted most successfully. 5-year-old Sarah, despite being born with a cleft palate and mild cognitive delays, thrived in her foster home. By summer, she was speaking incomplete sentences for the first time and showing curiosity about the world beyond Blackwood Hollow. The teenagers and young adults faced more significant hurdles. Many had never learned to read or write. Most held deeply ingrained fears about the outside world based on Elijah's teachings. Several young women, themselves products of consanguineous unions, were already mothers to children with severe congenital conditions. The challenge, explained social worker Ruth Henderson, was helping them understand that their suffering wasn't divine punishment, but the predictable result of closed genetic inheritance. This required compassion rather than judgment. Medical researchers from Johns Hopkins University, having learned of the case, traveled to Alabama to study the Blackwood family. Their examinations confirmed what the state health department had found: the family exhibited one of the highest concentrations of recessive genetic disorders ever documented in a single population. In one family line descending directly from Isaiah's oldest son, we identified 6 distinct recessive conditions, noted Dr. James Harrington in his research paper published in 1938. This represents a genetic collapse that typically takes many more generations to manifest. The intensification of consanguinity through the family's ritual practices accelerated this process dramatically. The Blackwood case ultimately contributed significantly to the growing field of genetic counseling. The detailed family trees constructed by researchers provided clear evidence of inheritance patterns that would later be confirmed through advances in genetic science. For the adult Blackwood women, integration into society came with difficult revelations. Martha Blackwood, Elijah's sister wife, upon learning about basic genetic principles, reportedly broke down in tears, saying, "All those babies we buried, we thought it was God's will, but we were causing it ourselves." The most challenging aspect of the case involved explaining to the Blackwood women the true nature of the returning ritual. Many had participated in preparing female relatives' bodies without fully understanding the violations that followed. Their complex emotions, grief, betrayal, anger, required specialized psychological support rarely available in 1930s America. Reverend Michael Collins, a Methodist minister who worked with several Blackwood women, noted their spiritual crisis. They're confronting the realization that practices presented to them as sacred were harmful both physically and spiritually. Their journey toward healing requires not just medical care, but a complete rebuilding of their world view. By late 1936, the Blackwood children had been placed in 17 different foster homes across Alabama. State officials made the controversial decision to separate siblings, hoping to break the cycle of familial interdependence and prevent any continuation of consanguineous relationships as they matured. The older generation story was often tragic. Several elderly Blackwoods, unable to adapt to life outside their isolated community, passed away within months of the intervention. Others developed severe depression as they grappled with the revelation that their lifestyle had caused immeasurable suffering to their descendants. The genetic legacy of the Blackwood family would continue for generations. Even with consanguinity ended, the recessive genes had become fixed in many family lines. Children born to Blackwood women who later married outside the community still showed higher rates of genetic disorders, though less severe than previous generations. This case established important precedents that would influence how authorities approached isolated communities in the future. It demonstrated that religious freedom, while protected constitutionally, had limits when practices directly harm children. It also highlighted the responsibility of public health systems to identify and intervene in isolated populations experiencing preventable suffering. As autumn returned to Alabama in 1936, Blackwood Hollow stood empty, its cabins slowly reclaimed by the forest. The family cemetery remained, a somber reminder of generations of preventable suffering and loss. Nearly 90 years have passed since authorities first entered Blackwood Hollow. Yet, the case continues to resonate through medical literature, legal precedent, and the lives of the survivors' descendants. The most comprehensive follow-up study, conducted in 1965 by the University of Alabama's Department of Medical Genetics, traced 122 direct descendants of the original Blackwood family. Their findings revealed both the persistent effects of genetic damage and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. The third generation of Blackwood descendants, grandchildren of those removed in 1935, showed significantly reduced incidence of genetic disorders, noted lead researcher Dr. Margaret Williams. However, certain conditions, particularly recessive traits carried by multiple family lines, continued to appear at higher rates than in the general population. Sarah Blackwood Johnson, the 5-year-old girl who had adapted so well to her foster home, became one of the case's most remarkable success stories. Despite her early health challenges, she graduated high school, married, and became a nurse. Her understanding of her family's history inspired her to work specifically with children born with genetic disorders. "My patients' parents often feel guilt or shame," Sarah explained in a rare 1978 interview. "I tell them that these conditions aren't punishment or failure. They're medical realities we can address with compassion and science. That's the lesson I took from my family's tragedy." Not all outcomes were so positive. Records indicate that at least 14 of the Blackwood children removed in 1935 to 36 experienced significant struggles throughout their lives. Several never fully overcame their developmental delays. A few, particularly those who had been adolescents during the intervention, eventually returned to isolated rural living, though none attempted to resurrect the consanguineous practices of their childhood. The Blackwood case had lasting impacts on Alabama public health policy. The state established one of the nation's first rural health monitoring programs in 1937, specifically designed to identify isolated communities at risk. This program, revolutionary for its time, recognized that geographic and cultural isolation could create public health emergencies requiring proactive intervention. Legal scholars continue to cite Judge Thornton's ruling as an important precedent in cases involving religious practices that potentially harm children. His careful balancing of religious liberty with child welfare protection established principles still referenced in contemporary cases involving medical care refusal and isolated religious communities. The medical documentation from the case found renewed relevance in the early days of genetic science. When researchers began mapping the human genome decades later, the detailed Blackwood family records provided valuable historical evidence of inheritance patterns for numerous rare conditions. Perhaps the most poignant legacy exists in the collective memory of northern Alabama communities. While the specific location of Blackwood Hollow has been deliberately obscured from public records to prevent exploitation, local oral histories preserve the case as a cautionary tale. "My grandmother used to tell us about the Hollow people," recalled Robert Jenkins, an Alabama historian interviewed in 2010. "It wasn't meant to frighten us, but to teach us about the importance of community connection and diversity, both genetic and social." Their isolation wasn't just physical. It was an isolation from knowledge that could have prevented tremendous suffering. The remaining adult Blackwoods who had been imprisoned eventually completed their sentences. Court records indicate that upon release, most changed their names and relocated to distant states, severing connections with their past. Elijah Blackwood died in prison in 1943, never renouncing his beliefs or acknowledging the harm they had caused. Martha Blackwood, who had cooperated with authorities and provided crucial testimony about the family's practices, lived until 1968. In her later years, she worked with researchers and occasionally spoke to medical students about her experiences, hoping that education might prevent similar tragedies. "I believed we were keeping ourselves pure," she told a medical ethics class in 1962. "I didn't understand we were destroying ourselves from within. Knowledge is protection. Remember that." Today, genetic counseling is standard practice for families with histories of inherited conditions. Advances in genetic testing can identify carriers of recessive traits, allowing informed reproductive decisions. These modern medical practices stand in stark contrast to the ignorance that trapped the Blackwood family in a cycle of intensifying genetic damage. The psychological impact of such extreme isolation, what researchers now call cultural sequestration, has become its own field of study, with the Blackwood case frequently cited as an early documented example. Modern protocols for integrating individuals from isolated cults or extremist communities draw on lessons learned from the Blackwood intervention. As we conclude this examination of one of America's most disturbing cases of generational consanguinity, we are left with profound questions about the balance between community autonomy and society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members, particularly children born into circumstances they cannot choose or escape. If you watched all the way through this dark chapter of American history, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and understand who truly appreciates the in-depth historical investigations on this channel." Don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories that mainstream media won't cover. Like this video to help our important educational content reach others who appreciate these historical investigations, and share it with someone who values learning about the overlooked shadows of our past. The Blackwood family's legacy serves as a powerful reminder that isolation, whether geographic, cultural, or intellectual, can create conditions where harmful practices perpetuate and intensify across generations. Their story, though difficult to confront, offers vital insights into the importance of education, community connection, and the careful preservation of both individual freedom and collective responsibility for preventing suffering.